The Nazis didn't just burn books or invade countries. They built what might have been the creepiest dating app in history. Instead of swipes, there were breeding homes, where women were expected to carry the children of SS officers for Hitler's future generation. This was no rumor. Lebensborn was an official SS project, founded by Heinrich Himmler in December 1935. Thanks to newly released evidence in 2025, we now know how far it stretched, from volunteer mothers to kidnapped children, and why so much of its history was buried after the war. To understand why such a program emerged at all, we need to go back to Germany's collapsing birth rates. Why the Nazis cared about birth rates. Germany's leaders were haunted by numbers. After the First World War, the country had not only been defeated but stripped of nearly 2 million young men, the very generation expected to marry and raise families. The demographic vacuum that followed was deep and visible. By the early 1920s, Germany's birth rate had plunged. One contemporary estimate showed a decline of about 43% between 1920 and 1932. This wasn't just a tragedy measured in grief. It was a statistic that set sirens blaring for officials who saw national survival tied to population growth. For Nazi leaders who came of age in that climate, the falling numbers looked less like a social problem and more like a looming security crisis. Hitler's racial ideology supplied the vocabulary of destiny and purity, but the cold arithmetic of manpower drove policy. If France or Britain could draw upon millions more young men for their armies, Germany would always fight at a disadvantage. Ideology plus cold demography combined into one urgent conclusion. In order to rebuild power, the Reich had to produce children at the same pace it built weapons. In this calculation, a child was no longer a private matter. It was a data point for the state's survival. Yet producing more German babies in the 1930s was anything but simple. Abortion was officially illegal but widespread enough to alarm policymakers, who described it as quiet sabotage against national objectives. At the same time, social stigma was suffocating. A woman who became pregnant outside marriage faced ostracism serious enough to ruin her reputation, her employment, and her child's future. Families often forced daughters into secrecy, or worse, pushed them to end the pregnancy. These pressures made sense to traditional communities, but to the Nazi state they represented wasted lives, potential future soldiers and mothers erased before they even began. The regime's response was radical: redefine motherhood itself as a battlefield. Nazi propaganda cast women not just as homemakers but as fighters of a different kind, soldiers of the womb. Posters, films, and speeches urged them to see pregnancy as an act of national duty. Carrying a child was reframed as the equivalent of military service, and large families were presented as more than a choice. They were a weapon against decline. By turning stigma into pride, the state hoped to dismantle the barriers that long kept women from bringing pregnancies to term. This campaign wasn't just rhetoric, it was engineered policy. The state introduced awards like the Mother's Cross, given in bronze, silver, or gold depending on how many children a woman bore. Loans, tax breaks, and benefits targeted families with larger households. Every step was designed to make childbirth feel less like a burden and more like public service. But all of this came at a cost. The incentives went hand in hand with new restrictions, like the criminalization of abortion framed not simply as a private decision but as treason against the Reich's future. Autonomy shrank while surveillance expanded, leaving women praised in propaganda yet stripped of true choice. Still, the drive for more births fell short. Statistics stubbornly lagged behind targets, and too many pregnancies still ended invisibly in closed clinics or families hiding young women away. Medals and loans hadn't produced enough results. For Nazi planners, the problem remained unacceptably urgent. Even with rewards and punishments, Germany was not outbreeding its enemies. So the state escalated. If propaganda and incentives could not fully solve the shortage, then an institutional solution had to be built. From the perspective of the Nazi leadership, a system that directly controlled and protected the right kind of births was more reliable than hoping social norms would shift on their own. And so, when officials later introduced Lebensborn, it wasn't an eccentric experiment but the logical next step of this demographic campaign. They had tried medals. Now they would try managed facilities. Seen through this lens, Lebensborn becomes clearer. Its foundations lay not only in racial ideology but also in the practical panic of a state staring at population charts. Falling births looked like missing regiments. Abortions looked like sabotage. Every Empty cradle was recorded as a national weakness. The program's later history has been remembered for its cult of Aryan purity, but the archives now show planners were just as anxious over mathematical shortfalls. Charts filled with gaps, generations they feared had vanished forever after the last war. By the mid-1930s, demographic anxiety and racial dogma had fused into policy. Births were counted, mapped, and weighted in importance as heavily as coal or steel. Families were encouraged to see themselves as part of the war effort before war had even begun, and women were elevated rhetorically as heroes while being simultaneously reduced to instruments of state planning. The step that followed, constructing special homes managed under SS supervision, wasn't a sudden departure. It was a continuation of the logic already in play. If numbers were destiny, then reproduction had to be organized, monitored, and enforced. And with that mindset, the groundwork was already laid for something far more systematic. The next phase would come under the guidance of one of the regime's most powerful men, a figure whose interest in controlling life extended from racial theory to birth itself. The birth of Lebensborn. Lebensborn began not as a rumor, but as an official SS project formally founded by Heinrich Himmler in December 1935. Overseen through the SS Race and Settlement Office, it was built on Himmler's conviction that Germany's survival depended not only on military power but also on the planned creation of children who met his racial ideals. Obsessed with selective breeding, he immersed himself in pseudoscience, livestock manuals, and genealogy charts. For him, reproduction was a matter of national planning. But when Lebensborn was first unveiled to the German public, it appeared less like a breeding scheme and more like a charitable network of clinics. Places where unwed mothers could bring pregnancies to term in modern, hygienic facilities without disgrace. Pamphlets described it as compassionate welfare, a safe haven for women at risk of social rejection. That image was no accident. The homes themselves were concealed in plain sight, often elegant mansions or converted estates presented as serene retreats. Entry, however, was tightly controlled. Only women who could provide certified Aryan ancestry going back several generations, and who fit the physical ideals of Nazi racial theory, were admitted. Once inside, they lived in seclusion under the constant supervision of nurses, midwives, and SS-affiliated physicians. Mothers were provided significantly better food and medical care than ordinary Germans struggling through the Depression years, a contrast that reinforced the official story of Lebensborn as benevolent and modern. Yet behind the comforting image of warm rooms and attentive staff lay a framework that transferred power from mothers to the state. After childbirth, guardianship was assumed by Lebensborn itself. The organization controlled placement and records, meaning parents lost authority over where the child would grow up and who would raise them. Comfort in the short term masked a loss of rights in the long term. The paperwork that followed each child was meticulous. Files recorded genealogical charts, physical characteristics, and developmental notes. Doctors measured head shapes, eye color, and other features deemed markers of racial value. Mothers were discouraged from asking questions and reminded that they were performing a duty for the Reich, not for themselves. Adoption into SS-approved homes was common, even when the biological father existed. Birth certificates and records were edited, sometimes destroyed, to obscure origins. Many women left these homes believing they had given birth under protection, only to discover the child had been diverted into official custody and that future contact would be impossible. By presenting the program as a way to erase social stigma for single mothers, the SS reframed what had been a source of deep shame. Unwed women, long marginalized, suddenly appeared to have a state-sanctioned role, as long as they fulfilled racial requirements. This veneer of modernity disguised a harsher reality. Private family bonds were dismantled, and natural parents were reduced to temporary participants in a process that delivered new infants into the Reich's possession. Far from liberating women, Lebensborn institutionalized their pregnancies. Propaganda concealed this reality with great care. Articles featured smiling nurses, bright nurseries, and strong, healthy infants, portraying Lebensborn as a triumph of modernization. Neighbors often believed they were witnessing the rise of enlightened childcare facilities rather than a system of state guardianship. In truth, beneath the flowers in the windows and the clean white linens, the SS maintained a process of child collection and redistribution. Babies who met racial criteria were directed into carefully selected families, while the women who bore them were told to move on as though the experience was finished. The scale of the project soon became substantial. By the war's end, Historians estimate that about 8,000 children had been born in Lebensborn homes inside Germany, with another 8,000 to 12,000 in Norway alone, where the program was exported and expanded after the German occupation. These numbers give a sense of how broad the experiment grew. Tens of thousands of human lives routed through a network of facilities meant to turn reproduction into organized policy. Day to day, operations looked disturbingly ordinary. Nurses tended mothers, midwives delivered infants, and clerical staff filed paperwork. The rhythm resembled any hospital or maternity ward. But the larger context altered the meaning of each task. A nurse's care ensured a baby reached full term, only for placement officers to remove that child. A file clerk's entries erased biological family identities in favor of new state-approved ones. Even the provision of comforting meals served a purpose. Compliance was easier when women felt temporarily pampered. Behind the curtain of charity, every routine was aligned toward the creation and redirection of infants into the SS racial and ideological framework. Himmler's design made the program durable. Rather than shock society with its true purpose, Lebensborn concealed its aims beneath the image of welfare and scientific modernity. By presenting the homes as charitable institutions and framing participation as patriotic, the SS avoided open resistance. In practice, the institution transformed reproduction into an administrative process. Records, approvals, and transfers took the place of family traditions, godparents, or community support. What is striking in retrospect is how efficient this model became. Once officials had normalized the practice of cataloging newborns and placing them into selected households, it opened the door to expanding the same mechanism to children who had not been born inside the homes. The precedent had been set. The Reich's bureaucracy could simply absorb a child, change the paperwork, and redirect its future under the guise of welfare. What began as clinics for German women evolved into a template that would later justify seizing foreign children from occupied territories. The appearance of normalcy masked something extreme. At its core, Lebensborn represented the merging of ideology with ordinary bureaucracy. Childbirth, one of the most private human experiences, was reduced to an entry in a government file. Women who entered thinking they would be protected discovered that the true goal was not their safety but the long-term custody of their children by the state. The program looked clinical, even polite, but it carried forward the broader Nazi vision. People could be managed like assets, assigned to roles, shifted across families, and cataloged for future use. By the late 1930s, Lebensborn had proven itself too valuable to the SS to remain only a network of maternity homes. It was also becoming something stranger, a space where ideology crossed into social engineering, where childbirth was reimagined as a patriotic service, and where the state itself played matchmaker in pursuit of racial goals. That unsettling next step is where the program turned from quiet clinics into carefully staged encounters. The dating app from hell. Imagine arriving at a castle not for a ball, but to be measured, photographed, and asked for family papers before being ushered into the company of an SS officer. This was the reality of Lebensborn's so-called matchmaking, an attempt to fold human intimacy into the order of state bureaucracy. On the surface, it looked clinical and patriotic, framed by the regime as a duty that linked ordinary women with Germany's supposed future elite. In practice, it was less a search for romance and more an assembly line of selection, inspection, and short, often anonymous encounters whose only consistent aim was pregnancy. The settings were designed to impress and to persuade. Women deemed racially suitable received summons to estates and castles adapted by the SS for their new function. Architecture was part of the message. Tall towers and elaborate halls suggested continuity with medieval nobility, as if joining the program tied participants into a legacy of lineage and strength. Yet once inside, women became subjects of assessment. Staff noted hair color, eye shade, body proportions, and posture, recording details into thick files. Ancestry had to be certified with documents stretching across generations to rule out undesirable heritage. The screening was invasive, often including photographs without clothing, reducing individuals to measurements on charts. Romantic preference mattered less than the purity of the family tree. For many, the intrusion was humiliating. Standing half-naked while strangers catalogued one's body hardly looked like patriotism from the outside. Still, propaganda made some women embrace it. Interviews later recounted by Hildegard Trutz, a young woman who took part, show the mindset at work. She believed that bearing a child for a selected officer was a direct service to the Reich, as essential as a man's duty in battle. Seen through that lens, the indignities became sacrifices offered to the nation. The matches themselves were arranged with varying degrees of formality. SS officers, both unmarried and sometimes married, were encouraged or pressured to father children with racially approved women. Official rhetoric described this as a noble act. The fathers were strengthening the Reich, the mothers were elevated above the ordinary roles of housewives or secretaries. Encounters were often short-term, carried out with little expectation of ongoing partnership. Anonymity was sometimes preserved deliberately, severing bonds between parents from the start. For the women involved, the experience could feel glamorous at first. They were dressed, fed, and housed in luxury compared to ordinary life during the Depression or war shortages. Shame, which dogged unwed mothers in everyday society, was inverted into honor inside these walls. The illusion, however, did not last. After birth, many discovered that their children were taken into SS guardianship and placed with approved families. Records were sometimes altered, original documents destroyed. Mothers were assured their child would be raised under conditions that would maximize loyalty and strength. For some, this was devastating, overturning the sense of reward they thought awaited them. Yet outcomes varied. Certain women left with their children, especially those matched to long-term SS partners, while others never saw them again. The program mixed volunteerism with bureaucracy, support with manipulation, an ambiguity that shaped bitter memories for decades. This complexity matters. In Germany itself, many women came forward willingly, attracted by propaganda or a sense of duty. In those cases, coercion was not always direct. They participated because they believed it was service. At the same time, the power imbalance was impossible to ignore. The state set the terms, chose the criteria, and decided the fate of the child. For women in occupied regions, participation carried different shades, sometimes voluntary, often shadowed by the presence of military power that left little space for genuine choice. What remained constant was the blurring of the private and the public. Pairings that elsewhere would have been matters of affection were here subjected to bureaucratic procedures. Ancestry charts replaced courtship. Medical files replaced trust between families. Even so-called romances could only proceed if approved by superiors. Every layer of paperwork ensured that personal relationships were integrated into the machinery of the state. Propaganda, meanwhile, painted a completely different image. Photographs showed smiling couples in gardens, enjoying leisure and vitality, the picture of youth serving destiny. Reality beneath those photographs was rows of women made to undergo detailed racial tests, clinicians measuring skull circumferences, and officials noting eye pigmentation. Where an outsider might imagine a blossoming relationship, participants remembered brief inspections followed by meetings orchestrated for reproduction. What would normally unfold in private over time became a task scheduled and certified by clerks. Later testimonies captured the emotional contradiction. Some women remembered pride during the pregnancy, repeating the slogans of national service, believing their role mattered. Yet that feeling collapsed when children were removed to other households, or when records were tampered with to break the link between mother and infant. Many described it as a betrayal, the moment of realizing that they had not been treated as mothers but as conduits for a process larger than themselves. Pride turned to grief, and that grief often endured in silence for decades. Stories collected decades later capture a kind of double memory. Women spoke of the grand estates, the uniforms, and the speeches, and in the same breath, of the moment nurses carried their infants away without explanation. Participation seemed like an elevation, but it ended in dispossession. The nickname dating app from hell lingers because the entire process took something designed to be personal and turned it into an extension of state paperwork. Encounters that began under chandeliers in castles ended in records filed away by men with measuring tools. By the time the program reached its peak inside Germany and Norway, thousands of children had been born or placed through its homes. Yet even this scale was not enough for a regime obsessed with racial arithmetic. The official network could not supply as many children as Himmler's office envisioned. That shortfall set the stage for the next and even darker phase of Lebensborn, one that expanded the program far beyond voluntary participants and elegant estates. Kidnapped childhoods. When ambition outpaced numbers, the SS turned from encouraging births to something far more violent: the abduction of children from occupied territories. What began as a program centered on suitable German mothers now swept across Europe, tearing sons and daughters away from their families to be remade as Germans. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Norway, the sudden knock of officials at a school or the family's front door became the moment childhood ended. The machinery of displacement operated with chilling efficiency. Children were taken from homes or classrooms with little explanation and loaded onto trains bound west. Journeys began in fear and confusion, ending in silence as thousands were moved across borders with parents left behind not knowing why their children were taken, or if they would ever return. Officials cloaked the process in vague language: medical exams, foster care, German guardianship. But the purpose was clear: extract children who fit racial ideals and dispose of those who did not. Upon arrival, the first step was examination. Doctors and racial experts measured heads with calipers, noted eye and hair color, and compared features against charts that imagined a model of Aryan appearance. An afternoon of tests could determine a child's fate. Those who seemed to match were earmarked for Germanization, a euphemism for re-education and placement with approved families. Those who failed could be sent to bleak orphanages, concentration camps, or, in the worst cases, killed. This was not science but a sorting process, conducted under the guise of research, with life-or-death consequences. What made the ordeal especially cruel was the way it was dressed up. White coats and orderly charts gave mothers and children the impression of professional care, when in fact their very identities were being dismantled. New names and new documents appeared within days, replacing old ones. A child who spoke Polish in one village might re-emerge weeks later as a German orphan, with foster parents vetted by the SS. Past lives dissolved into paperwork, while bewildered children were told to call strangers mother and father. Norway became one of the most intensive sites of this policy. Children born of German soldiers and Norwegian women were considered highly prized, but the reach went further. When unions did not produce enough numbers, outright removal filled the gap. Geography played a role. Proximity to Germany made transport easy, turning Norwegian children into a steady stream for the program. In Poland, the situation was harsher. The large population, combined with crude racial hierarchies, meant constant fear hung over families with fair-haired or blue-eyed children. Parents knew that if a child looked German enough, they could be taken without warning. The system was not chaotic improvisation but deliberate structure. Detailed files tracked each child from abduction to resettlement. Trains moved on strict schedules, with officers carrying lists that tallied every seat. Foster families were given guidance on how to reshape the child, replace their language, erase old customs, enforce obedience. Children who whispered in their native tongue faced harsh punishment. The goal was to make memory itself feel dangerous. Slowly, villages could be dissolved through the rewriting of their children one by one. Estimating the full scope has long been difficult because of the widespread destruction of records. Historians now agree that a range of figures exists rather than a single definitive total. Some scholars point to about 20,000 Polish children taken, while others cite estimates many times higher, suggesting figures up to 200,000 might have been targeted. What is certain is that Lebensborn oversaw only a portion of this vast policy, as revealed in post-war trials like the Rewrote case. Many abducted children passed through broader SS channels rather than Lebensborn alone. The most responsible way to understand the scale is to recognize a wide spectrum in the sources. Historians cite numbers from around 20,000 at the low end to much larger claims, but the destruction of files makes precision impossible. Even that range captures how entire regions were shaken. In some Polish towns, several students from a single school vanished in one day. In rural areas, parents sent children into hiding, hoping their appearance wouldn't draw the attention of German officers. Reported cases also surfaced in Slovenia, Alsace, and other mixed regions where German-looking children attracted notice. No country under occupation escaped the possibility. The new clarity provided by surviving documents reveals not isolated incidents but systemic removal operating across borders and years. Life after abduction varied but carried the same intention. Some children were placed directly into German households that renamed and raised them as their own. Others were sent into state-run institutions where the indoctrination felt relentless. Letters home were forbidden, contact with real families blocked. Compliance was rewarded with food, clothing, and approval. Resistance brought punishment or transfer to harsher facilities. Over time, some children grew into adults who barely remembered their origins. Others spent decades after the war searching through fragments of paperwork to rediscover who they were. The deeper cruelty lay in erasure. Names carefully scratched off birth records, documents rewritten with false parentage, places of origin changed to distant towns. For children taken at a young age, this meant their original identity was not just hidden but obliterated. Parents left behind often assumed their sons and daughters had died in bombings or mass deportations. In truth, those children could be alive under different names, already assimilated into German families, without knowledge that anything had been stolen from them. By the end of the war, the silence built into the program was nearly total. Archival fragments now affirm what survivors long suspected. This was not sporadic wartime chaos but a calculated network. Train sheets, adoption instructions, and coded correspondence point to a system built and sustained with official oversight. Where documents are missing, the gaps themselves are evidence of how thoroughly the SS attempted to erase the record. What remains shows that every number represented a severed family, every ledger entry a stolen childhood. Though exact totals remain an open debate, the range of estimates itself underlines the enormity of what happened. Whether it was 20,000 or far more, the human impact is clear. Whole communities were destabilized, countless families fractured, and the very idea of identity treated as something the state could reassign at will. It was abduction dressed as welfare, pseudoscience masquerading as policy, and bureaucracy carrying out theft on an industrial scale. Understanding Lebensborn in this expanded light requires seeing beyond the breeding homes to the broader machinery that trafficked children across borders. Here, the Nazi vision of remaking society reached into the smallest details of daily life, targeting not just adults but toddlers, schoolchildren, and infants cradled in their mother's arms. Having seen how children could be taken, renamed, and reshaped, we are left with the question of what their lives looked like once inside those carefully controlled facilities. Worlds designed to appear comforting, but built firmly on control. Life inside the facilities. Step inside a Lebensborn maternity home, and it looked strikingly different from the rest of wartime Germany. Whitewashed walls, polished corridors, and trays of steaming food conveyed the image of calm and comfort. Photographs from the period show smiling nurses serving plates of meat and glasses of milk, luxuries far beyond what most households could hope for on ration cards by the mid-1940s. Mothers inside these facilities ate better, rested more, and received consistent medical attention. To the SS, however, this was not charity. It was strategic investment. Each pregnancy was considered critical to the regime's future, and the women carrying them were provided whatever comfort was needed to ensure a successful birth. The women themselves were told their role was simple: rest, comply, and carry their child to term. Fathers were often listed only as anonymous SS officers in staff records, hidden behind initials or registry numbers. This anonymity shielded the men while leaving women dependent on the institution. Many mothers avoided asking what would follow birth, reassured by the food and attentive care they received during pregnancy. Yet the moment labor ended, the tone shifted. Nurses who had spoken with warmth for months now directed the new mother to hand over her child. In some cases, survivors recalled being allowed to keep their baby for a brief window, sometimes as little as 2 weeks, before custody transferred to the state. This interval softened the transition, but the separation that followed was no less disorienting. Once the infant was gone, identities were rewritten with clinical finality. Birth records might be altered or destroyed, replaced by new certificates designed to sever the chain of connection between child and parent. What had seemed personal quickly revealed itself as bureaucratic procedure. Children judged racially suitable, but not yet placed into adoptive families, were settled in institutional care. These facilities diverged sharply from the maternity wards that had nurtured their mothers. Inside, the days followed a strict schedule. Meals at set times, language drills, punishments for slips into native tongues. Toys were scarce, and personal items were often taken away. The point was not to nurture individuality but to erase whatever ties the children might still hold to past identities. A child arriving as Piotr or Anna could, within days, be reintroduced to caregivers as Peter or Annalise, with instructions that their old names, and by extension their old lives, no longer existed. Language and emotion were both tightly controlled. Children were punished for speaking anything other than German, even when they struggled to understand commands. Emotional displays such as crying or clinging to caregivers were labeled as weakness. Comfort was rarely offered. Play, when allowed, was limited to regimented group activities designed to emphasize obedience rather than creativity. Instructors and attendants treated these habits less as discipline for the moment than as early indoctrination. Many of the practices echoed later requirements for Hitler Youth, but here they were applied in nurseries and dormitories to toddlers barely past infancy. The contrast with the maternity homes was telling. Pregnant women had been fed butter, eggs, and vegetables while families outside scraped by on substitutes. Nurses had spoken gently and kept their environments calm. Yet the moment those newborns were separated, they entered a world where food was functional, care was clinical, and daily life was rigidly regulated. Mothers were valued for their ability to produce healthy births. Children were valued only to the extent they could be reshaped into obedient members of a racial ideal. The program's priorities were visible in that shift. Comfort for the mother to ensure delivery, deprivation and routine for the child to erase individuality. Records reinforced this depersonalization. Files tracked head circumference, eye color, and genealogical estimates, but rarely recorded small details like a child's preferred toy or first word. In many cases, state numbers replaced names. By the time children were placed in adoptive families, they arrived stripped of context, presented as if they were blank slates. Foster parents were advised to treat them not as children with histories but as young Germans awaiting upbringing. For mothers who later searched for their sons or daughters, this erasure made recognition nearly impossible. Without documents or names that linked one life to another, even locating survivors became a desperate and often hopeless task. Anonymity extended to fathers as well. Mothers might have known their partner wore SS insignia, but explicit names were rarely included in personal files. This veil preserved officers from accountability and made it impossible for children, decades later, to trace paternal lineage. Survivors described the staggering absence of knowledge about their origins. Mothers unsure of what to tell, children unsure of what had been hidden. It was intentional, part of a broader system designed to flatten personal ties until the program itself stood as the only authority figure in a child's life. The layout of the children's institutions reflected this mentality. Dormitories emphasized sameness. Rows of identical beds lined the walls, blankets folded with military neatness, faces watched over constantly by nurses and instructors. Privacy did not exist. Days began early, often starting with grooming inspections and collective songs. Even play objects such as wooden blocks were set to specific tasks, guiding children to replicate patterns rather than use imagination. Every ritual and gesture signaled uniformity, and staff were instructed not to show excess affection. A child who reached for repeated comfort risked reprimand or cold refusal. Attachment was seen as a distraction from loyalty to the Reich. This emotional void left marks that survivors carried into adulthood. Many later described how they struggled to form trust or intimacy, never able to untangle why. What had become natural in childhood, obedience without affection, shaped their behavior long after the war. Some recalled nightmares of dormitories without warmth. Others spoke of unresolved confusion about identities that had been taken from them. Their losses extended beyond family ties. They had been denied the foundations of a normal emotional life. Surviving paperwork adds to this chilling clarity. Official documents show meticulous attention paid to lineage charts and physical classification, but no space granted for subjective or emotional observations. Childhood was reduced to compliance against checklists. For those children eventually adopted into German families, the transition often served only to deepen the disconnection. They were expected to accept new parents without question and to believe the fabricated records that accompanied them. For children old enough to remember their origins, this sudden reinvention was disorienting. For younger ones, it eliminated even the possibility of recalling another life. What brings these stories into sharper focus today are archival testimonies from mothers and children themselves. At least some women recounted being permitted to hold onto their baby for only brief weeks before separation. That short period, described in testimony as 2 weeks in one case, made the eventual loss harder to bear. Children remembered stepping into facilities where care was manufactured but never personal, and where their earliest words or touches were met with discipline instead of tenderness. It is in these details, the gap of 2 weeks, the confiscation of a toy, the silence after crying, that the machinery of control becomes clear. New research has also shown that the reach of these facilities did not end at the gates of SS-run estates. Local officials, midwives, and social workers played active roles in placing children once they left the homes. In post-war testimonies, some survivors recalled being moved into Catholic foster households or parish-run orphanages. The records suggest a patchwork of involvement. In some communities, parish actors offered temporary refuge and preserved records. In others, these networks placed children discreetly with new families under state direction. What emerges is not a single policy but a scattered, contested picture where religious institutions intersected with the program in uneven ways. The outcome across all these variations, however, was consistent. Mothers who thought they were carrying children in safety often found themselves cut away from them. Children grew up molded by structures that denied their pasts. Comfort ended at the point of birth. What followed was a life managed through schedules, renamings, and the suppression of attachments. The system created obedient wards of the state at the cost of family, history, and human warmth. Those conditions inside the facilities reveal not only how the program functioned in daily life, but also how easily it crossed into the influence of surrounding communities. That blurred line would become more visible in the immediate aftermath of the war, when many assumed that the program had been dismantled along with the SS, only to discover that its traces lingered in unexpected places. The Catholic Church and silent partners. The children left behind in the ruins of the Reich did not simply disappear when the facilities closed. Their care fell into a fragile web of institutions struggling to cope with unprecedented chaos, and among those unexpected actors were local Catholic parishes and social networks that became entangled in their fates. This is where the story of Lebensborn entered a quieter but no less complicated chapter. The role of the Catholic Church and its silent partners in handling the aftermath. Archival research, particularly collections held in the Erasure archives and referenced in later journalistic investigations, suggests that local clergy, parish offices, and even convents sometimes played a role in placing Lebensborn children into new homes. The evidence is uneven, with gaps that make definitive conclusions impossible, yet enough material survives to show that post-war Catholic networks were occasionally points of contact in resettlement. Historians stress this is not evidence of a sweeping institutional directive from Rome or national episcopal authorities. Instead, it reflects a patchwork response at the community level, where priests, nuns, and parish workers made practical decisions amid the disorder of 1945 and the years immediately after. Those decisions often blurred intention. On one hand, some clergy helped prevent children from wasting away in overcrowded camps and orphanages. On the other, those same interventions sometimes erased birth names, altered baptismal records, and complicated reunification attempts for decades to come. What was framed as compassion at the time could later be remembered as concealment. The ambiguity makes it difficult to separate charity from complicity, since both outcomes arose from the same procedures. Children removed from uncertain environments, baptized under new names, placed out of sight. On the ground, much of this work passed through familiar channels. Parish-based midwives and lay social workers, some of whom had ties to Lebensborn clinics before 1945, continued their grassroots caregiving roles. When the formal framework collapsed, those same women became essential intermediaries in Catholic regions. They could identify households willing to foster or adopt, liaise with orphanages, and provide infants with continuity of care. Their notes rarely mentioned Lebensborn or wartime involvement at all. By the time a parish registry recorded a baptism, the child's past was already obscured. Priests also became central figures in this process. In rural towns especially, they served as witnesses to custody agreements or as the spiritual authority who blessed new placements. Their involvement gave legitimacy to adoptions that otherwise might have been viewed with suspicion. Families who received children often felt reassured to see their parish priest officiate or sign the paperwork, without asking too many questions about origins. Silence from the pulpit mirrored the reluctance of many communities to dwell on troubling details. In many cases, no one wanted to publicly question whether a child had been born inside an SS home or taken from occupied Europe. Local civic elites shared in this discretion. Mayors, clerks, and trusted families often overlapped with parish authority in the countryside, and together these figures created continuity. A mayor could authorize a new identification card while the parish priest baptized the child under a different name. To the broader community, this process brought stability at a moment when disorder defined every corner of life. Simple acts like signing identity papers or conducting a baptism reassured war-shaken families that society was being knit back together. What those gestures concealed, however, were the erasures embedded in them. Family histories wiped away, legal parentage rewritten, origins made untraceable. This dual role is why later historians describe a gray zone of involvement. Catholic institutions were not masterminding Lebensborn's continuation, but they became necessary arteries through which its outcomes passed. Some priests or nuns almost certainly believed they were fulfilling their calling to shelter the vulnerable. At the very same time, by accepting the children without carefully recording their pasts, they inadvertently helped conceal the machinery that had created them. Archival testimonies suggest that for many communities, the priority was social stabilization, not uncovering the darkest experiments of the Nazi years. To officials and clergy overwhelmed by widows, refugees, and displaced children, the practical question had an immediate answer. Place the child, move on, restore order. The result was a silence shaped not simply by fear or guilt, but by practical pressures. War-torn Europe had millions of displaced people competing for attention and resources. Governments faced strained budgets, destroyed infrastructure, and restive populations. Diving deeply into the origins of every war orphan was rarely politically possible. Against that backdrop, Catholic parishes and civic authorities filled the vacuum. By emphasizing community stability, they allowed Lebensborn's human legacies to fold into ordinary family life, albeit at the cost of lost identities. The involvement of midwives highlights this continuity most clearly. Before 1945, they were conduits of Nazi racial policy, recording births, sending reports to SS offices, ensuring mothers complied with program requirements. Afterward, many rebranded themselves as neutral caregivers helping communities recover. But their experience and connections made them indispensable links in the quiet passage of children into Catholic households. Without them, many infants might have languished in state facilities. Yet through them, many identities were permanently severed from origins that could no longer be traced. This was not overt conspiracy, but the soft power of habit and professional networks that crossed regimes. Some surviving fragments carry poignant reminders of how deeply ingrained this partnership became. Parish records note baptisms conducted on children whose birth certificates had already been altered. Foster families recall priests gently encouraging them to treat the children as their own, with no mention of where those children had come from. In oral histories, survivors describe growing up Catholic, raised in faith and community, only to learn decades later that their beginnings were deliberately obscured. These memories underline how a sense of belonging could be simultaneously genuine and manufactured. The wider lesson is one of continuity between authoritarian projects and existing institutions. The SS designed Lebensborn, but its legacy remained in place because local structures, parishes, clinics, registrars, folded those children into everyday life. Authoritarian experiments often succeed not by isolating themselves but by co-opting familiar institutions, borrowing their legitimacy, and passing through their channels. This was precisely what allowed Lebensborn children to be absorbed into the fabric of society even after its formal structures were supposedly dismantled. It would oversimplify the story to say the Catholic Church as a whole colluded with Nazi projects. The reality the archives present is subtler. Individual clergy, lay workers, and local offices facilitating placements under extraordinary circumstances. Some acted to protect children, others out of convenience, still others because no one else was available. Motives ranged from compassion to avoidance, but the effect was consistent. Midwives, priests, and local officials smoothed the way for identities to vanish into new paperwork, baptisms, and families. That is why historians now treat the post-war afterlife of Lebensborn with caution. It was not neatly shut down in 1945, but threaded into the recovery of European communities through silent partners who made its children invisible. Understanding this complicity does not mean condemning every actor involved, but it does require acknowledging how silence and procedural cooperation allowed erasures to endure. The unspoken decisions of clergy, social workers, and administrators had consequences just as lasting as the homes themselves. Tracing these children's paths reveals more than the fate of individuals. It exposes the difficulty of reckoning with authoritarian pasts. Communities valued stability over scrutiny, institutions prized cohesion over accountability, and the result was a legacy that remained hidden for generations. This gradual absorption explains why later survivors, seeking their true origins, so often found themselves blocked by blank files, contradictory entries, or clerical seals that offered no answers. The blurred lines of charity and concealment, of silence and survival, set the stage for what followed. In the years immediately after the war, not only children but records themselves became subject to disappearance. Files were scattered, altered, or intentionally burnt, leaving survivors to search for fragments decades later. These efforts to obscure or manage the past would become even more deliberate as defeat loomed, turning the problem of hidden origins into official erasure on a massive scale. The end. And the erasure. As the Reich's collapse accelerated in 1944 and 1945, Lebensborn homes were thrown into disarray. Staff who had spent years meticulously recording every birth, every ancestry chart, and every adoption arrangement suddenly turned on their own files. Bundles of records were dragged into cellars or courtyards and deliberately destroyed. Fire consumed the very documents that testified to the program's existence. Registers vanished, leaving children in cribs with no trace of who their parents were. This was not incidental. It was a systematic attempt to ensure that, if Germany was defeated, there would be little evidence of how far the project had gone. The erasure severed fragile threads connecting children to their origins, and for many that paper trail was gone forever. Some records did survive, though only in fragments. Allied units entering former homes found stray files left behind, but investigators quickly faced a problem of scale. Across Europe, evidence of mass killings, slave labor, and concentration camps demanded urgent attention. In that context, Lebensborn appeared smaller and less pressing, and most recovered documents were boxed and stored rather than thoroughly analyzed. For survivors, this neglect compounded the deliberate destruction already carried out by the SS. Trying to trace a single child in the shadow of genocide meant confronting archives that were partial at best, and in many cases sealed by governments wary of what they might disclose. Different nations faced this aftermath uneasily. In Norway, where thousands of children had been fathered by German soldiers during the occupation, official policy was often harsh. Instead of being welcomed as victims, children were frequently stigmatized as reminders of betrayal. Many were bullied at school, institutionalized, or treated as potential threats to national security. Admitting the full scope of Lebensborn's presence would have forced authorities to grapple with both German crimes and Norwegian collaboration. The result was avoidance. Similar dynamics unfolded in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France. Families whispered of children vanishing on trains, but governments turned their attention to rebuilding cities and infrastructures. Exhausted by the war, officials chose silence rather than face the disruption of confronting complicity head-on. For individuals trying to piece together their identity, the consequences were devastating. Requests for birth certificates often yielded documents that had been altered or expunged. Approaching local churches for records brought only gaps or rewritten entries under new names. Adults raised in German adoptive families sometimes grew suspicious when community rumors or physical differences from their supposed parents didn't add up. Confronting foster parents, they received half-truths or outright fabrications. Some were assured their biological families had perished in bombings, their pasts erased by tragedy rather than design. Others were told nothing at all. The blankness was intentional. Bureaucratic silence outlived Nazi power. This blankness left psychological wounds that survivors described later as impossibly heavy. Living with the knowledge that something essential is missing, but impossible to access, trapped many in a permanent search. A number spent years tracing inconsistent details, handwriting in a ledger, an odd remark overheard as children, slight discrepancies in dates. Some traveled to the ruins of a former home, hoping to find a surviving register. Most encountered stripped walls and empty shelves. They were left in a kind of limbo, uncertain whether they belonged to the families that raised them, to invisible ones suggested by whispers, or to no stable identity at all. Governments likewise avoided the subject because exposure risked embarrassment. Addressing Lebensborn in full would have shown that local authorities in occupied countries sometimes cooperated with the SS. It would have revealed that officials after 1945 continued to fold Lebensborn children into routine foster systems without asking difficult questions. Easier, politically, to leave the issue submerged. That avoidance cost survivors dearly. With every decade, the chance of reunion shrank. Parents who might once have been found grew old and died. Fathers seldom left records. Mothers' memories faded. Delay was a second round of erasure, official and long-lasting. There were exceptions. In Poland, for example, a structured recovery effort, the so-called Revindication operation, was carried out to reclaim children abducted and Germanized by the Reich. By 1950, that initiative had managed to return about 3,404 children, though estimates of how many were lost in total vary enormously. Some historians point to tens of thousands, others to much higher figures, but the deliberate destruction of files ensured precision was impossible. What all researchers agree on is that reunification was rare and often riddled with disputes. Some children resisted being taken from German families they barely remembered as adoptive. Others returned to find their parents gone, their homes destroyed, their communities changed beyond recognition. Numbers illustrate the scale, but the reality lay in fragmented, painful stories of partial recovery. By the late 20th century, survivor groups began to chip away at this silence. They gathered testimonies, compared memories, and lobbied governments to release files. These efforts sometimes unearthed catalogs of names or medical notes, though often without clear parental details. For individuals, even a sliver of information, a place, a date, a note of transfer, meant validation. But these breakthroughs also revealed the scale of loss. Entire registers were missing. Many Lebensborn homes yielded no paperwork at all. Survivors described it as standing before a locked door with no key, aware a story was inside but permanently closed off. The situation began to shift only recently. DNA databases introduced for genealogy and medical purposes provided tools that governments had withheld. From the 2010s onward, and especially through 2024 to 25, survivors submitted samples and began to find matches across Europe. Cousins in rural Poland connected with relatives raised in German towns under invented names. Norwegians discovered siblings who still remembered when they were taken decades earlier. Projects carried out by the Erasure archives and independent journalists amplified these discoveries, confirming through documented cases that stolen identities could sometimes be restored. Reunions that once seemed beyond reach became possible, though never simple. These modern reconnections carry both joy and strain. DNA evidence can bind people across gaps that paperwork left empty, but it cannot restore shared childhoods. Survivors describe feeling caught between the families who raised them, often with love, though under false pretenses, and the biological relatives whose existence was hidden. Identities become complicated, forcing choices about how to balance truth against history lived in silence. Some families embrace newfound relatives. Others struggle with anger or disbelief when secrets emerge, reopening questions of complicity that were buried for decades. Even in the most successful reunions, the scars of delay remain. Every year of wartime cover-up and post-war silence equaled another thread severed, another generation lost. While genetics now bridges part of this gulf, many survivors stress that time cannot be recovered. Their lives unfolded under uncertainty, shaping their sense of self in deeply permanent ways. Governments avoided the reckoning, and only now in the 21st century has technology begun to undo their evasions. The ironies are hard to ignore. The elaborate effort to obliterate names and records, burning files, swapping certificates, erasing lineages, was designed to conceal families forever. For decades, it appeared to have worked. Official denial and community avoidance prolonged that concealment. Yet now biology itself produces answers where politics and archives failed. Bloodlines prove more resistant than paperwork, and connections long thought erased resurface in databases open to ordinary citizens. This recovery raises as many questions as it answers. For every survivor who finds family, another remains locked in silence. For every fragment uncovered, another file was deliberately burned. But the trajectory is clear. What once looked forgotten emerges again, bit by bit, pieced together by science and persistence. Lives that were rewritten by force are now being written again, not unchanged, but at last acknowledged. These belated reconnections mark one form of survival, but they did not shield those who lived through the immediate aftermath. For many children born or taken through Lebensborn, the war's end was not the end of hardship. What awaited them outside the facilities was another trial. The way their societies treated them once the guns fell silent. The survivors and the stigma. After 1945, the children connected to Lebensborn carried a weight they had not chosen: stigma. What the Reich had once claimed as a mark of superiority became, in defeat, a source of scorn. Many were branded as Nazi bastards or Hitler's children, cruel labels that erased their innocence and tied their very existence to the crimes of a regime they were too young to even remember. Their appearance, their birthplaces, or whispers of their parentage were enough to mark them as outsiders. Instead of being seen as victims, they became scapegoats, punished for origins beyond their control. In daily life, that stigma took root early. Schoolyards across Europe became a proving ground for cruelty. Children recalled not isolated insults but years of steady exclusion. Playgrounds where classmates pushed them aside or repeated taunts overheard from resentful parents. Teachers often did little to counteract it, uncertain whether these children carried ideological taint. The irony was painful. Blonde hair and blue eyes, traits that Nazi propaganda had celebrated, now exposed them as the heirs of an enemy. In Norway especially, the stigma was severe. Several sources document how children linked to Lebensborn were regularly bullied, and some were institutionalized by the state rather than welcomed as war orphans. Similar experiences appeared across Denmark, France, and other occupied countries in varying forms, though not identical everywhere. Mothers, meanwhile, endured their own punishment. Women who had entered Lebensborn homes or had relationships with German soldiers were accused of collaboration. Reprisals were public and humiliating. Heads shaved, women paraded through streets, reputations destroyed in front of neighbors. In many towns across occupied Europe, this ritual of retribution was a way for communities to reassert dignity after occupation. Yet for the women, the exile lasted far beyond the first act. Many never remarried, found work difficult, and struggled to defend children already marked by stigma. Their earlier pregnancies, once praised or tolerated by Nazi structures, became the reason they were cut off from their communities. For children without family protection, the consequences deepened. Many were placed in foster homes or state institutions where stigma hardened into official categories. Records labeled some explicitly as of German origin, reducing them to symbols of enemy occupation. Staff often separated these children emotionally from their peers by constant reminders that they were different. Unlike other young refugees or orphans left behind by war, they bore the perception of guilt. Some were neglected, others punished more harshly, and in some extreme cases, institutionalized in psychiatric facilities rather than cared for. The suffering was rarely sudden or violent. It was a steady erosion of belonging, a quiet exclusion that never lifted. These early experiences left scars that carried into adulthood. Survivors repeatedly describe a fractured identity that grew out of secrecy and silences. Many never knew who their fathers were or found the version of their origins passed down by mothers incomplete or evasive. Others lived with renamed identities, their birth certificates altered or destroyed. Some spent decades combing through contradictory papers or archives, searching for answers that were lost when records were burned. The wounds were not only personal but generational. Their own children and grandchildren inherited that shadow, growing up inside families where history was concealed but never absent. One widely known example humanizes this legacy. Annie Frid Lyngstad, later famous as a member of the Swedish group ABBA, was born in Norway to a German soldier and a Norwegian mother. Because of that origin, she was stigmatized after the war and eventually moved to Sweden with her grandmother for safety. Her story is singular, yet it illustrates how even decades later, fame did not erase the painful beginnings shared by thousands of less visible survivors. Intergenerational trauma became a quiet inheritance across different countries. Descendants later described a sense of heaviness in their families, a feeling that something vital was unspoken but present. As DNA testing and archival revelations in the 21st century exposed hidden origins, many grandchildren discovered that silence had been deliberate. This discovery frequently brought confusion and resentment. Instead of a neat family history, they confronted a past woven from fragments of loss, stigma, and secrecy. Identity, already fragile, became further tangled. Survivors often tried to protect their families by staying silent. Mothers avoided naming fathers, and children avoided asking questions, fearing the answers would bring shame or rejection. But this protective silence often distorted relationships. Descendants grew up sensing something had been denied to them, leading to mistrust or feelings of exclusion. Some internalized the silence as judgment directed at them personally. What began as stigma in the 1940s rippled into chronic struggles of identity that affected multiple generations, distorting trust and closeness in families across Europe. In societies where national pride was closely tied to resistance, those with Lebensborn origins found themselves especially vulnerable. In France and Poland, for example, narratives centered on heroism during occupation left no space for acknowledging children whose fathers had been German. Their existence contradicted the story communities wanted to tell about themselves. For these societies, forgetting was easier than acceptance. The children themselves became repositories for unspoken shame and anger, reminders of a past people preferred to bury. Even decades later, survivors often encountered subtle discriminations. In workplaces, origins whispered behind their backs could erode trust or stall advancement. In personal lives, revelations of their background strained marriages or friendships. Some saw doors close quietly with no explanation, detected only in the reactions of others. Stigma survived in silences as much as in insults, shaping outcomes in education, careers, and relationships. Yet within this bleak inheritance, resilience emerged too. Across Europe, survivor networks grew. Organizations in Norway, Germany, and elsewhere have given individuals forums to exchange stories, recover fragments of their pasts, and finally find recognition. For many, being acknowledged as more than the label Nazi child became a turning point. Collectively, they pushed against decades of silence by gathering in public, voicing their wounds and claiming dignity as survivors rather than as symbols of shame. Recent interviews reflect this pivot. Survivors now speak not only of grief but of deliberate reclamation. DNA evidence has helped some reunite with long-lost siblings or cousins, building connections fractured in childhood. Others give talks in schools where their story serves as warning about how easily state power intrudes into family life. The act of speaking openly has given them control over narratives once defined by others. For many, it is the first time they can talk without fear, turning silence into testimony. Reclamation remains uneven, but its significance is deep. Children once touted as the Reich's racial future became unwanted symbols of disgrace after 1945. Now, through persistence and solidarity, they are reshaping their identity. They refuse to let Nazi categories or post-war stigma define them. Survivors insist on telling their own accounts, shifting from imposed shame to chosen meaning. The process is slow, burdened with loss, but it shows how identity can be rebuilt even after decades of distortion. And it leaves an unresolved question hanging in the air. With so much lifelong stigma inflicted on these children and their mothers, how many of the people who built and ran the system that caused it were ever held to account? How many got away with it? In the years immediately after the war, the question of justice turned to the worst crimes uncovered across Europe. Gas chambers, mass shootings, medical atrocities. These captured the attention of tribunals and the global press. Against that backdrop, the Lebensborn program often seemed minor by comparison. Its records looked less like evidence of atrocity and more like paperwork, the language of mothers' homes, adoptions, and welfare. Images showed nurses and cradles rather than barbed wire. In that environment, Lebensborn rarely became a courtroom priority. For survivors who lived through it, this neglect was another wound. While other crimes were indicted and punished, their own experiences seemed pushed to the margins. When trials did examine child transfer programs, the results were inconsistent. Proceedings such as the RuSHA trial at Nuremberg acknowledged stolen children, falsified guardianships, and displacement across Europe. Yet the courts often concluded that Lebensborn e.V. itself was not the sole orchestrator of these kidnappings. Kidnappings had been carried out by multiple agencies, and in legal terms, that made direct prosecution of Lebensborn leaders difficult. Some were accused of complicity. Others, including senior figures, argued they were running a welfare service. The court stopped short of convicting most on kidnapping charges, finding insufficient proof that Lebensborn itself bore sole organizational responsibility. This nuanced verdict explains why numbers on post-war accountability remain hard to pin down. At the major trials, the evidence that carried weight was usually the most visible and undeniable. Starvation, executions, and photographs of camps became central. By comparison, Lebensborn looked administrative, its cruelty embedded in forms, inspections, and missing names. These distinctions mattered in court. Judges working through mountains of atrocity. Evidence prioritized what was clear and immediate. The result was that, while extermination crimes defined tribunal outcomes, the quieter dismantling of identities inside maternity homes slipped from focus. The consequence was uneven accountability. Only a minority of Lebensborn staff ever faced formal prosecution. Nurses, clerks, midwives, and administrators, those who had enforced inspections or filed falsified paperwork, largely returned to their communities after 1945. Many resumed their pre-war professions without interruption. A midwife who had once managed state-approved births could appear in a local hospital as simply another caregiver. An administrator who logged stolen files could reappear in a municipal clerk's office as if nothing had changed. Survivors searching for those names decades later discovered that many had lived ordinary post-war lives, often retired quietly with pensions intact. The way guilt was framed in post-war Europe helped shield them. Responsibility was imagined as a pyramid. Leaders at the top bore full guilt, while broad populations were deemed misled or passive. Lebensborn staff existed somewhere in between. They were not high-ranking strategists, but they had shaped fates directly. Yet because their actions left little photographic shock value, they were often described, even by themselves, as mere bureaucrats or caretakers. Courts and governments, seeking quick paths to stability, accepted those explanations more easily than probing deeper responsibility. This framing was reinforced by deliberate silence. In many towns, neighbors knew who had worked inside the facilities but preferred not to stir painful histories in the fragile years of rebuilding. Governments were cautious as well. Norway, for example, faced its own post-war stigma against children fathered by German soldiers. Putting Lebensborn staff on trial risked exposing state failures to protect those children after liberation. West Germany, occupied with Cold War reconstruction and political reintegration, chose to pursue only a handful of prosecutions. Even then, sentences were comparatively light, sometimes only a few years for organizational involvement in matters later recognized as profound human rights violations. For survivors, these gaps in justice reinforced feelings of abandonment. Their stories of loss, falsified names, and displacement were real, but when the people who oversaw those processes reappeared in public life without acknowledgement, it sent a clear message. Their suffering did not merit the same attention as other victims of the right. Many survivors described growing through adulthood with a hollow distrust of authority, because the lines between wartime perpetrators and post-war officials seemed indistinguishable. The picture only began to shift decades later. From the 1980s onward, as archives opened and investigative journalists pursued overlooked stories, dossiers of names resurfaced. These showed, conclusively, that the vast majority of personnel connected to Lebensborn facilities had never stood before a court. Some were well-known figures at the time, others were ordinary caregivers. A few rose to prominence in local civic life, their past connections ignored. Public exposés in the 2010s and 2020s revealed how completely silence had shielded them, and how bureaucratic continuity allowed former participants to blend into civilian roles. Part of their escape lay in the nature of the program itself. Lebensborn had been wrapped in the language of welfare and family care. That framing survived in memory. Midwives told communities they were simply helping mothers. Clerks said they were processing paperwork to support children. By the time prosecutors tried to distinguish acts of protection from acts of coercion, the records were missing or destroyed. In this way, the myths presented during the war endured and reshaped post-war remembrance. Historians now describe this as less a cover-up than a kind of bureaucratic inertia that worked in perpetrators' favor. When a chart went missing or a file was labeled confidential, this did not appear outrageous compared with mass graves being exhumed. Yet for survivors, those bureaucratic gaps erased their lives just as thoroughly as violence would have. This difference in perception, the visible brutality of camps versus the hidden cruelty of paperwork, explains why Lebensborn staff slipped away from scrutiny. Even the courts recognized these ambiguities. The Rewrote trial, for example, admitted evidence of kidnappings and re-education programs, yet acquitted Lebensborn of direct responsibility, ruling that it could not be proven that the organization as a whole ordered mass abductions. This verdict reflected the scarcity of surviving documentation and the difficulty of assigning organizational guilt. But while the legal standard allowed individuals to go free, survivors carry the impact every day in missing families and obliterated histories. The outcome creates an inverted sense of justice. A small number of staff were punished, yes, but the overwhelming majority never faced a judge at all. Survivors, already burdened by stigma and loss, lived side by side with individuals who had once signed the papers removing them from their families. Decades passed before wider society acknowledged that those who processed forms and carried records had exercised real power in shaping destinies. The imbalance highlights an unsettling fact. Programs like Lebensborn were embedded seamlessly in ordinary professions. Nurses, clerks, midwives, priests, the same roles found in any community, became the infrastructure for a state project of racial engineering. When the war ended, those same roles persisted, allowing participants to blend into post-war life without explanation. Responsibility was diluted in routine, and society, overwhelmed by recovery, allowed silence to smother it. Today, these revelations serve as a reminder that accountability is not guaranteed, even for large systems of abuse. The traces in archives show the ease with which complex programs can fade from focus once memories harden and priorities shift. Survivors lived with voids in their histories while staff quietly retired. Only in the past decade has the imbalance been fully documented, confirming that justice for Lebensborn was, at best, fragmentary. That record raises an unavoidable challenge. If selective memory and bureaucratic avoidance allowed so many to slip through unpunished, what does it say about the way societies manage disturbing truths? That question doesn't end with the past. It points toward how ideas once dressed up as welfare or care can persist in new forms, sometimes far from their original setting, but with risks just as profound. Modern echoes of eugenics. The collapse of Nazi Germany did not end the questions that fueled projects like Lebensborn. It only changed their shape. While the uniforms, propaganda, and racial pseudoscience of the 1930s are gone, debates about birth, genetics, and desirable traits continue in different guises. What has shifted are the tools, the language, and the framework in which these conversations take place. What has remained is the persistent temptation to use science and policy to steer something as personal as reproduction. Today, genetic technologies exemplify that shift. Techniques such as non-invasive prenatal testing, NIPT, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD, and CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing have become central to debates about reproduction. They are framed as medical progress, designed to eliminate suffering or prevent the inheritance of serious disease. Doctors and bioethicists describe possibilities like removing mutations for cystic fibrosis or reducing the risk of childhood cancers. But even as science emphasizes health, the underlying set of questions looks strikingly familiar. Whose children are seen as desirable, who decides, and how should technology be used to shape the next generation? The fertility industry shows how these choices unfold in practice. Sperm banks, egg donation services, and surrogacy agencies present potential parents with catalogs of information. Traits such as education level, height, or athletic ability often become part of the selection process. Here the pressure comes not from state commanders but from market logic. Parents make consumer choices, but those choices are guided by categories that echo an older logic of selection. The framing differs. Today it is about choice and compatibility rather than national duty, but the effect is the same. Human traits ranked and preferred according to perceived value. Governments remain part of this story, particularly as aging populations and declining birth rates raise alarms. Across Europe and East Asia, officials debate how to encourage more births. Some offer tax benefits or subsidies for larger families, while others promote specific family models. In Germany during the 20th century, policymakers once promoted racial health as the justification. Today, the justification is demographics and economic stability. Yet once childbirth is discussed in policy papers as a resource to be managed, future workers or taxpayers, the mental framework starts to resemble earlier calculations. The context is different, but the structure of thought remains recognizable. Germany itself illustrates the caution shaped by its history. In reunified Germany, legislators removed the embryopathy indication in the 1990s, a legal clause that had once allowed abortion in cases of fetal disability. The decision was guided in part by concern that such a clause carried echoes of past eugenic reasoning. More recently, the public debate over reimbursement for NIPT demonstrated how this caution persists. In 2022, Germany agreed to reimburse NIPT within limited medical indications, but disability rights groups staged vocal protests. They argued that state support for selective testing risked reinforcing stigma against disabled lives, even if justified as medical advancement. For them, the echo of history was not abstract but immediate. The fear that labeling certain births as less desirable could resurface through technology rather than ideology. These debates show why the concept of private eugenics has entered scholarly discussion. Unlike state-driven programs of the past, where governments impose criteria, today the pressure often comes through personal or market decisions. Parents choosing embryos, clinics advertising better traits, insurers reimbursing some forms of testing but not others. Academics argue over whether such choices constitute a new form of eugenics, or whether framing them as parental freedom changes the picture. What is striking is that the core dilemmas remain. How do societies balance freedom, equality, and the desire to avoid suffering in the most intimate of all decisions? CRISPR and related technologies sharpen those dilemmas further. Researchers stress their focus on curing severe inherited illness, but headlines often speculate about designer babies. While sensational versions of this claim are exaggerated, the possibility that social norms or market incentives could drift toward selecting for non-medical traits is actively discussed in bioethics. The issue is not that such outcomes are inevitable, but that history demonstrates how quickly scientific tools can be redirected when governments or societies begin to see reproduction as a lever of national policy. Language again reveals how underlying logic persists. Officials in the 1930s spoke of soldiers of the womb. Today, politicians talk more softly about family responsibility or securing the next generation. Words like investment, future strength, or biological contribution appear in policy papers about demographics. These phrases do not replicate the overt racism of earlier decades, but their framing shifts childbirth from private decision toward collective expectation. Once the act of raising children is cast in such terms, debates about choice and autonomy become narrower. Sperm banks and fertility clinics also highlight the continuity of certain preferences. In glossy brochures, traits such as height, intelligence scores, or eye color remain prominent. These are not dictated by state ideology but by market demand. Yet the repetition of the same traits across cultures shows how ideas of what counts as better are deeply structured. Even without coercion, the logic of ranking and selection never disappears. Some ethicists warn that widespread pursuit of similar traits could reduce diversity, both biological and social, replicating the same error once made by authoritarian programs, mistaking uniformity for strength. Surveillance adds another layer of unease, though here the discussion is grounded in evidence rather than speculation. Massive DNA databases, created for medicine or genealogy, now contain millions of profiles. Scholars and activists warn that if demographic fears overtake safeguards, such repositories could easily be redirected toward monitoring birth patterns or reinforcing social divisions. This is not a prediction of certain misuse, but an ethical question flagged by those paying attention to history. How might governments or corporations react, and what protections should exist to prevent abuse? Such caution echoes Germany's own regulatory strategies, where past experience shapes stronger emphasis on privacy and oversight in genetic research. The continuity lies not in direct imitation of the past, but in the recurring questions that arise when science intersects with reproduction. Every new technology, whether NIPT, PGD, or CRISPR, reignites dormant tensions about what counts as progress, which traits should be encouraged, and who has authority to decide. Disability activists in Germany, pointing to their country's history, insist that these debates cannot be divorced from moral questions about inclusion and human value. Their testimonies remind us that issues once weaponized by ideology do not vanish with the ideologues who created them. The 2025 context makes these warnings clear. Bioethics committees, patient advocacy groups, and disability activists now stand alongside scientists and parents in debates once dominated only by experts. This expansion demonstrates progress, but also the long reach of history into present controversies. That reach is sharpest in Germany, where the shadows of Lebensborn and other programs hover over every new law or clinical policy. The central lesson is not that today's technologies inevitably follow the path of programs like Lebensborn. The situations are not the same. But history shows how easily reproductive science can become entwined with broader fears or ambitions. What matters now is governance and debate. The framework societies build to ensure that technologies serve health and dignity rather than narrow definitions of worth. Germany's experience makes this debate sharper, but the questions stretch globally. The lesson is direct. Technology alone does not determine outcomes. How societies debate, regulate, and safeguard its use matters most. That truth, reinforced by Germany's own history, offers a reminder that even as science moves forward, the the ethics surrounding birth and choice remain contested terrain. And it is precisely that recognition which casts new light on what the Lebensborn program represented at the time. Lebensborn is often remembered as an odd side project of the Nazis, but it was much more. It showed how demographic panic, racial ideology, and the cooperation of ordinary institutions could combine to produce devastating abuses of family and identity. The homes were not only about babies, they were about controlling memory and deciding whose lives were valued. That history resonates today because new genetic tools raise similar governance questions. Who decides how reproduction should be shaped, and by what criteria? If you could ask a survivor one question about identity, what would it be? Drop it in the comments.